Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. What is the first step in becoming a better leader? Self-awareness. Today's guest, Cron, is an expert on the Enneagram, host of the popular podcast Typology, and the author of The Road Back to You, an Enneagram journey to self-discovery. Ian uses the Enneagram personality typing system as a tool to help leaders foster self-awareness and emotional wisdom. On today's episode, we dig into the 9 personality types to discover how each type shows up, their red flags, and their unique gifts. If you're interested in taking the Enneagram assessment yourself, you can dig into the link on Ian's website, ianmorgancron.com. That's ianmorgancron.com. And if you enjoyed today's show, please help others find us by leaving a rating or a review. Get ready to take some notes on this one. Here's my conversation with Cron. Well, Cron, thank you for taking a minute and coming on the show. It is certainly a pleasure to have you on from Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Greetings from Music City.
That's right. So you are, the road back to you man, the typology man, the Enneagram man, and obviously so much more. But I want to really dig in a little bit to each type in a few minutes. But before we do that, can you share a little bit about the background on the Enneagram for those that may not be familiar with it? And really kind of how you've used it, and maybe even it's relevant to sort of say how not to use it.
Yeah. Well, the Enneagram's roots are quite old. It's an ancient personality typing system that over the years has evolved, particularly in the last 50 years as it's come in contact with modern Western psychology. And it continues to evolve. It's a wonderful instrument that can be used for a wide array of purposes, both in the corporate space and in the personal development space, which is what I love about it. It has just wide application, and it's also immediately accessible. So I love all kinds of personality instruments, whether it's Myers-Briggs or Colby or Hogan. I mean, I've used all of them. I think they're fantastic. But what I love about the Enneagram is that it is so immediately accessible, and it is applicable both in the corporate or organizational setting, but also just in your family, with your friends. To me, it's an all-encompassing, useful tool that anybody can benefit from.
Mm-hmm. And because there's 9 types, and we'll go through that. And
yes,
but how do you tell people not to use it?
Yeah, well, there's I actually have an Enneagram ethics sheet that I hand out when I'm in corporate settings. I mean, the first thing is the Enneagram is uncannily accurate in its ability to describe different types of personalities. And so what I'm always telling people in corporate settings is it's absolutely critical that you never weaponize that knowledge and use it against somebody. So, for example, if you're a type 6, and we'll go through this in a minute, I know, you don't want to say to somebody ever, "Oh my gosh, stop doing that. You're being such a 6 right now," right? Mm-hmm. The Enneagram should only be used as an instrument to help people become the best expression of who they are. Never use it as a way of dismissing them or insulting them sometimes, right? Another thing I would say that you should never do with the Enneagram is make the assumption that once you know someone's Enneagram type, that you actually know them, right?
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that you don't want to make the assumption that, a person who is a 4 on the Enneagram couldn't do the kinds of tasks that someone who is a 1 can do. Does that make sense?
It does. But for our listeners, a 4 and a 1, what are those, just so they know?
Sure. Well, a 4 is if I was going to use in shorthand, is a more artistic kind of a person who has a more of a higher degree of aesthetic sensibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a 1 is a perfectionist, right? And you might, so for example, you might say, well, gosh, you can't be an accountant because you're a 4 and you're more, it's like, well, actually, that's not true. So in other words, here's how I like to describe each of these 9 personality types. I refer to them as low resolution pictures, right? They are not magic pictures that give you like incredible sharp detail about what goes on in the interior world of these 9 types of people. What it gives you is a far better picture than the one you're operating with at present, but it's still low res, right?
Got it.
And so just thinking you know somebody's type doesn't mean that you have all the intimate details of their competencies and their character and all that stuff. It's just giving you a clear understanding of their operating system. But in no way is it comprehensive. But I'll say this, right? It's better than what you're operating with right now.
Got it. Sure. And you know what? I heard you say once, and I loved this, that you want to be careful with kids. If you give this test to your kids, my husband and I have 3 teenage daughters, that, and they come out as a 3 or a 9 that you don't box them into that type, because then maybe they behave in a way to sort of stay inside of that box for you. But maybe you can expand on that. That's cool what you said.
Yeah. I mean, people, especially with their children, they would like to get a shortcut into insight into their children. The Enneagram can give you that. What I tell people basically is, the personality, nuts and depending on who you speak to, but the nuts and bolts of it are in place, let's say between the ages of 5 and 8, right? But the paint is still wet on the wall, right? You don't really know what color it is until it dries, right? So I always tell people, wait until late adolescence, or late teens when the paint is a little bit more set and you really can tell what color it is at that point, what type they are at that point. But before that, you run some risks of, boxing your kid into a type that you have projected for them. And then, kids are very sensitive. They're very smart. They'll start to live into what your expectations of them are.
Sure.
So I'm always telling parents, just be curious. One of the best ways you can love your child is just to be curious about them.
Cool.
And talk to them as if you're curious about who they are. And over time, the paint will dry and you will know.
So, that's fantastic to sort of give them a backdrop, our listeners a backdrop. But what would you say, how would you advise our listeners to find out what's the best way to discover their type from an Enneagram perspective?
Sure. All right. There's 2 ways, at least.
I mean, one is to read your book, right? The Road Back to You, which is such an awesome read.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'll tell you why I wrote it, because it'll help the audience understand why I recommend it. So there are a lot of Enneagram books out there, and many of them are really great. They're content rich, but lots of them are very long. They're 400, 500, 600 pages. They're also very technical sometimes, right? And so they're not easy reads. I'm always like, hey, these people can't quit their day job to learn the Enneagram, right? So there was no primer out there. There was nothing that was an introductory kind of like, and so my goal in writing The Road Back to You was, how do I write a book that gives people enough information in 200 pages that it can move the needle in a positive direction in their lives without their having to learn it. And then if they chose not to read another book on the Enneagram, they got a lot out of it, right?
Absolutely.
Or it's a great gateway drug into the longer books, but they needed a primer first, right? So I'd say that's what makes The Road Back to You kind of a special thing. It's an introductory primer to the Enneagram that is more than just, it's going to give you enough information to really make some cool applications in your life, but it's not going to overwhelm you with everything there is to know about the Enneagram.
Well,
right?
And Ian, I can attest to that because I am staring at the wisdom of the Enneagram, the big book that you're talking about, and then your book, right? So I couldn't agree with you more from my own personal experience, how much easier it is. You've made it easier for us. So thank you for that. That's awesome.
Yeah, my pleasure. So reading a book is one way to get to know the Enneagram, right? And it's a great way. The other way is obviously you take a workshop. I do corporate workshops. They are 8 hours long. That too is introductory, but then you have the ability to interact with whoever's teaching, right? The other way is you can take an assessment, right? And I will say this, that not all assessments are created equal, right? Like self-report assessments in psychology always have a significant margin of error, or not significant, but meaningful. How's that? And, so I use one, the assessment I have is called the IEQ-9. People can get it if they go to my website, Cron, IANCRON.com. And there's a tab for IEQ-9. And the IEQ-9 is the most accurate, quantitatively researched assessment available for the Enneagram. And what I always tell people is take that assessment and then meet with somebody who really knows the Enneagram to validate the result.
Okay.
Right.
Yep.
And Myers-Briggs will say that, and others. It is very helpful to get someone to sit with you and say, "Yep, that sounds right."
Sure.
And so the IQ-9 to me is sort of the gold standard out there. I don't say that because it's mine. I just say it because it's true.
And
really.
you can do it in, I think your website says 20 to 40 minutes or something, right? So you can do it. You can get it pretty quickly, which is cool.
Yes, and if you go at the standard level, I think you get a 22-page report. And if you go at the pro level, it's like a 40-plus page report.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so it goes into great detail about your particular style as a leader, as a person in the corporate setting, at home, and in other settings as well. So I'm very proud of that thing.
Well, and I think one of the things I've heard you talk about, and that I know, is that we all have sort of every type inside of us. That because it's easy to sort of say, for example, I'm a 3. It's easy to say, oh, I'm a 3. And sort of stay in that box, but recognizing we have all of those. And then 2, that there's healthy and unhealthy ways in which that sort of manifests itself, which I think is also interesting. Can you touch on that a little bit before we sort of move into each type, which I'm looking forward to you breaking down for our listeners?
Sure. Yeah. So we are all 9 types. In the course of a given day, I draw on the energy, the resources, the faculties of all 9 types. But there's one in particular that is my and your default setting, right? Mm-hmm. It's the one type whose underlying motivation we identify with the most, more than all the underlying motivations of the other 8. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So there's just one that has a gravitational pull, like, yeah, that really sounds like me more than the other 8,
Yeah.
And so one of the things I would say to people and often do is nobody is a pure type. So there's no such thing as a pure 3 or I'm a pure 5, right? Mm-hmm. No, you have to be a little, and this is another reason I love the Enneagram, right? It's not this boxy, clunky thing that says you are in this box and you are, it's like, no, I'd say that it's a little bit more like this way of being in the world is more like you than these other 8.
Got it. Okay.
So it's a little softer than what you might get in other typologies, but I actually find that increases my level of trust in the system because, people are complicated, and so if you try to box me in too much, I think as a system, I start to after a while go, this sounds a little too certain of itself in a way that I don't think is helpful.
Well, sure. And there's things that happen in our lives that take us to, as you call them, our wings, right? So they take us, which is, and of course, there's things that happen in our lives that make us maybe show up as the not best version of ourselves based on our type.
Yes. And that point goes to what you were saying earlier. All of us can operate in a healthy or average or unhealthy range in our own type, right? So we might talk about someone who's a healthy 3 or an unhealthy 3, right? And those are 2 different expressions of the same type. And in the course of a day, by the way, and I know that for each of these types, we're moving around between unhealthy and healthy. Mm-hmm. So, you could have a great morning and you're really humming along as your best 3. And then you get a call, at 11:30 that something went wrong at the office. And then, suddenly you're at the lower end of health in your type. And maybe one of the ways of a few that we might say, well, what does unhealthy or healthy look like is, healthy would be, I think, when you're in a state of grounded self-awareness, that, you are in touch with and aware of how you are thinking, acting, and feeling in the moment and why you are. And you're you have this, and Daniel Goleman would call it emotional intelligence,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
That you're in the moment, you're able to observe and regulate your thoughts, feelings, and actions as you interact with others from moment to moment, right? So I think when you're in a healthy place, you know that who you are, what you're doing, and the impact that you're having on other people, and you're able to adapt in the moment to make the most considered and wise choices.
So you may know when you're slipping into sort of that unhealthy
Yes.
space of your type, but then you also know through this level of awareness, okay, now I'm there. I have this awareness around this. Now I need to be intentional about shifting it.
Yes. So again, this speaks to the sort of dynamic nature of the Enneagram. Again, this is a reason I love it. It accounts for the fact that the human personality is fluid. We're on a call right now. My personality in this moment would be very different than if you shipped me into a battlefield somewhere, in Iraq right now. My personality would adapt. It would be different than what it is right now. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
In fact, if it didn't adapt, I would begin to say to you, sounds like there may be some pathology present.
Right.
When a personality can't adapt, if it starts to get rigid, right? That's when you start to wonder as a therapist, this sort of sounds like this person has some pathological features happening in their personality. So I think that the Enneagram does help us understand, hey, when you're in stress, when you're under stress and things aren't going great, this is what you start to look and act and feel like. And when you're in a great place, this is what you tend to act, think, and feel like. So that, as you grow in your understanding of your type, you can begin to say, like I can, oh boy, I'm not at my best right now. What new choices can I make, given that I have this new level of self-awareness, to head off bad stuff if I don't pull myself out of this spiral? It's terrifically helpful.
In just a minute, we'll get back to the episode. But first, here's a free resource I want to share with you. How many of you are leaving money on the table because of costly negotiation mistakes? Getting the best possible outcome in a negotiation can be a challenge. Most people leave money on the table because they don't know how to navigate the conversation. We get it, and we're here to help. Go to 5negotiationmistakes.com to download our free PDF. 5 negotiation mistakes costing you money. In this free resource, you will learn how to avoid common mistakes. You discover things like how to identify and adapt to different style negotiators, how to maximize your deal points, how to ask with confidence. Once you read this PDF, you'll no longer feel frustrated and overwhelmed when it's time to negotiate. So here's all you need to do next. Download 5 negotiation mistakes costing you money. Check it out, read it, review it, and start negotiating like a pro. All you have to do is go to 5negotiationmistakes.com for the free download. That's 5 like the number 5, negotiationmistakes.com. Now back to the conversation. The 9 types. I mean, and so we're teasing our listeners quite a bit here, I think, which is okay. But can you walk folks through the kind of the brief descriptor of each type, and maybe we have so many business people that are listening and leaders. How does it show up at work in each type, and what are the things to be aware of? You know this so well. I've heard you talk about it, Ian. And what are the sort of the do's and don'ts? Right. That would be awesome if you walk through each 9.
Yeah. So let's just go back to the beginning. So the Enneagram is a personality typing system. It teaches there are 9 basic personality styles in the world. This is important. Each of the 9 types has a distinct way of seeing the world and an underlying motivation that powerfully influences how that type thinks, feels, and behaves on a typical basis. Okay? So I raised the subject of that underlying motivation because that's how you determine type, right? It is, do you or do you not identify with the underlying motivation of the type under consideration? So as your folks listen right now, I'm going to go through those unconscious motivations or underlying motivations, And they ought to be just listening to which of those sounds most like me, right?
Yep.
They may identify with all 9 at some level, but there's one that's going to sound more like them than the other 8.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So let's blow through it. I'm going to go really, really fast.
All
okay.
Right. Yeah.
So type 1s are called the perfectionists, and these are very meticulous, hardworking, reliable, responsible, moral, ethical people who are motivated by a need to perfect themselves, others, and the world. Okay.
Okay.
If you're working with a 1 on a team, right, as a leader, I'll just give you random ones, right? So here's something you can do. Leverage their talent for quickly spotting mistakes and improving things. Like a 1 can improve anything, right? They spot mistakes and they know how to make them better. I'll tell you one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to let a 1 put off starting or completing a project for fear they won't do it perfectly.
Okay.
Yeah, ones can be notorious procrastinators because it's not because they're not hardworking. It's because they tend to fixate on things being perfect, and therefore they're like, I don't even want to start something if I don't know I can do it completely correct from the outset. So anyway, 2s are these very warm, they're called the helpers, and they're very warm, they're very caring, supportive people, and they're motivated by a need to be needed and loved by others. Okay. These are the most highly interpersonal. This is the most interpersonal type on the Enneagram. So here's a do with them. You can leverage these highly developed interpersonal skills by placing them in positions where there's a lot of customer or people contact.
Okay.
Like you don't want to put a 2 in a back office.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So that's actually a don't, right? Like don't put them in isolation. These are people who live for relationships. They go to bed at night thinking about relationships. They get up in the morning thinking about relationships. Okay. They are the most sensitive to criticism of all the types.
Okay.
When you do a review of a 2, you really need to keep in mind that they're not like other types. Yeah, you need to give them feedback, but you just need to be aware that they will take to heart feedback. It'll land on them in a much harder way than it will on other types. Okay. So 3s, you're a 3. So these are amazing human beings. They're called the performers.
Well done, Ian. Well done.
Sometimes we call them the achievers. These are the most success-oriented, image-conscious folks on the Enneagram, all wired for productivity. They're motivated by a need to be or appear to be successful and to avoid failure at all costs, right? So when you're working with 3s, just remember, they want to win. So you want to set clear performance targets and success measurements out for them. You know what I mean? Like they want to know, what do I got to do to win? A don't for 3s you want to make sure that your 3s are not running over coworkers on the way to the goal line. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Because you all are so task oriented. You are so accomplishment oriented. And sometimes you lose sight of the people around you en route to the goal, right? And, you can, if you're a 3 that's not very self-aware, you can run people over and cause all kinds of friction in the house.
Sure.
Type 4s are called the romantics. Sometimes they're called the individualists. They're creative, they're sensitive, they're temperamental, they're motivated by a need to be unique and special. I don't run into a ton of 4s in a lot of industries because a lot of them work for themselves. They tend to be disproportionately represented in the creative arts, right, or in creative fields.
Okay.
But you need to, if you're working with them, here's a do. Let 4s express their creativity, their depth, that aesthetic sensibility, and their distinct style. And what you want to discourage or help them to not do is completely live in that realm of feelings and emotions. They need to activate their critical thinking to balance out their depth of emotion. They're very deep people emotionally. Type 5s, the investigators, analytical, and tend to be emotionally detached and private. Fives are motivated by a need to gain knowledge, to conserve energy and resources, and avoid relying on other people. So twos with fives, give fives a project, tell them when it's due, and then let them get it done however and wherever they choose. So sometimes when I work with companies, I worked with a company not long ago, and they had it's a very large company, and they had a department, an IT department, in which they had 500 coders.
Wow.
And a lot of the coders were fives.
Okay,
right?
sure.
And we were talking about, well, how do you incentivize fives? And of course, the threes were all saying, give them more money, give them advances, give them promotions, right? Well, that's a three thinking that everybody else is a three.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
And I'm like, well, I'm not saying fives don't want that, but I'll tell you one thing you can do is give them more autonomy.
Okay.
Tell a five they can work from home. Tell a five they can, once you give them the project, let them go down to Starbucks or a coffee house and work in the corner, because they tend to be private people for whom lots of relational contact is more draining than it is for other types.
Interesting. Okay.
So there's a do and a don't for fives. Give them more autonomy.
The investigator.
Yeah, right. Exactly. The investigator. Sixes, the loyalists. We think there are more sixes in the world than any other type. That's a speculative statement, but I think it might be right. They are committed. They're practical folks. They're very loyal, as their name would suggest. They're also worst case scenario thinkers who are motivated by a need to feel secure and safe, right? So there's a lot of sort of what I would call vague anxiety rolling around in the operating system of a six. So, but I would tell people, listen, you need to listen patiently when sixes ask questions, and they will ask questions about everything, right? Mm-hmm. But when they start asking a lot of questions about new initiatives, you need to address their concerns, because what they're trying to figure out is, have you as the leader thought through all the worst case scenarios? Do you have a contingency plan for everything? Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, people will sometimes say, oh, sixes, they oh boy, it's like a wet blanket. They're always figuring out what could go wrong. I was working with a company in Silicon Valley, and it had a bunch of 30-year-old, super smart, aggressive threes, right? And mm-hmm. eights. We'll get to eights in a minute, and sevens. Yeah. And they, we can do this and we can do that. And they got whiteboards everywhere, and they're just going around. And this young CEO, and by the way, there also tons of money are getting dropped on them, right?
Mm-hmm, sure.
And this young guy said to me, he said, I've got this guy, he's a little older, he's on my team. And every time we go through these dream team meetings, and I get done, and he raises his hand and he goes, excuse me, I have a question, And he says, everybody in the room, like the oxygen leaves the room, because what comes out of his mouth next is, do you really think that's a good idea? Shouldn't we wait for the fourth quarter when we have more cash flow? This could lead to, our not meeting payroll. He always sees the dark side. He says he's always championing what could go wrong. And then he asked me, do you think I should let him go? And I said, oh, wow. You absolutely cannot let that man go.
You need him.
He is the only person tapping the brakes in this room. Yeah. Because all of you are not seeing what could go wrong. You believe you're bulletproof. This is the only guy in the room who's saying, we're not invincible. And we might want to just slow down and think through what the implications are of different decisions. That's the gift that six brings. Mm-hmm. You just want to make sure that you listen to them when they ask questions. And you better have answers to their sake and for yours. You know what I mean?
Well, it's funny. My COO is a six, and I'm a three, and it is an unbelievable partnership, because she is an amazing asset and totally pumps my brakes. It's sort of like, I joke with her and I say, you and my mom and my husband can all say something in about 1 second that just stops me in my tracks, and in a really healthy way.
Yes.
It's powerful.
Yes. Well, that's because 3s, 7s, and 8s, for different reasons, you all are very assertive numbers. And in a way, 3s and 8s, one of the things that you can forget, particularly 8s, is that you're not invincible. Mm-hmm. And that, there are things that could come along that could undo you. And the 6 will remind you, hey, you know what? bad things can happen, and I can see all of them. The 6 is saying, and I know all of them, and let me tell you about a few of them so that as you make a decision, it's informed.
Sure.
Right?
Absolutely.
Anyway,
Yeah,
great people.
They're
Types,
awesome.
Types, oh, I love them. Type 7s, the enthusiasts. These are the joy bombs of the Enneagram. These are fun, spontaneous, adventurous people who are really motivated by a need to be happy and to plan stimulating, fascinating experiences to avoid difficult feelings, right? When I was working with 7s, I tell people who are working with 7s, for example, you need to give these talented folks a long leash. You need to give them an expansive job description, and you need to encourage them to stay on track because they're distractible, right? They just love the new. What's next? Because they're real visionaries. I mean, I think we could go through the types. I could probably come up with different leaders who represent each of these types. But, I think of a type 7 possibly could be someone like Steve Jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I can't speak to how healthy he was as a 7.
Right.
But he has that 7's visionary kind of view of the world. I mean, they're wonderful people. What you don't want to do is let an optimistic 7, and they are optimistic to a fault, downplay or wallpaper over problems and failures. 7s can do that. They don't like to sit in the feeling of failure or disappointing or anything like that. And they'll cover it over and say, hey, this isn't such a bad thing. And we learned this. It's like, no, dude, that was just called a failure.
Exactly. That did not work,
right?
Man.
That did not work. You need to own it. Okay.
Right.
8s are the challengers. We sort of lionize these people in the corporate world, leadership world. These are commanding, intense, confrontational people who are really motivated by a need to be strong and to assert control over the environment and others to avoid revealing weak or vulnerable sides of their person. Okay. So here's a do for 8s, right? They are always going to test authority, right? 8s are always trying to figure out who's in charge here. And they like to go up against things, right? They have a lot of what we call oppositional energy. So I'm always telling people with 8 who are working with 8s, you got to set limits. You got to provide regular, straightforward feedback. You got to establish clear boundaries. And here's a big thing with 8s. You got to tell them the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, even when the truth is bad.
Oh, okay. They just want the truth. Give me the facts.
Just give me the facts, no matter how bad they are. So now there's an example, okay, of something that's important. And this is why this stuff is so helpful. Can you imagine giving the same 360 review to an 8 that you would give to a 2? Remember, the 2 is the helper who is so sensitive to criticism. Mm-hmm. Now, if you gave an 8 the same kind of review you gave a 2, they'd be like, you're not telling me the whole truth. This is too soft. This is, you know what I mean? This is too diplomatic.
Absolutely.
Or this is whatever.
Right.
But if you gave a 2 the kind of 360 that an 8 wants, you'd crush them because you'd be like, okay, here are the facts. You stink at this. The 8 would take that and go, oh, okay, I can fix that.
Yeah.
The 2 would be out in the parking lot drinking a 5th of scotch. You know what I'm saying?
Well, it's funny because
recover.
Literally this morning I sent my assistant, who is a 2, a book I thought she should read that I just thought would be really helpful for her. And she replied in an email that said, is something wrong? Did I do something wrong? If so, I'd love your feedback. And absolutely nothing wrong. It was just a matter of, hey, I really think this would be interesting for you, and I think you'd find it really helpful, as she takes on a couple other initiatives. So it's so funny what you're saying, because sort of that helper feedback, concern around if they've, maybe not helped from a relational perspective. So interesting.
Right. Okay. So, all right. So this is a good little test, sort of a good test case here. Where did the attention of that 2 migrate toward immediately?
I think she probably went and worried that she wasn't taking care of me, right. That maybe she'd done something wrong, that I was criticizing her, right, which they don't like, and maybe she was embarrassed. Right. So that's what comes up for me, but certainly better than I do.
Well, no, you nailed it. Her immediate concern was your relationship with her. Sure. It wasn't, she didn't go to, well, I'm not serving the company. She's like, well, is our relationship okay? Did I let you down? Did I, am I not doing something? Now, if you had done that to an 8, the 8 would have would have picked the book up, looked at it, and probably, thrown it on a desk somewhere behind us and said, well, if I get to it, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So do you see how knowing this? I mean,
So
this is
powerful.
what I work with leaders all the time. I mean, in corporate settings, I'm like, the meta skill for the 21st century, and this is research-based, this is evidence-based, this is a statement, okay? The one I'm about to make is the competency that people need now more than ever is self-awareness and the development of these sort of soft interpersonal skills. If you don't have a grasp on this stuff, you are not going to succeed and thrive in organizational systems going forward. So if you know, okay, this is how a 2 responds, that's going to, or I know how 2s are. I know their way of being in the world, and I got a 2 who works for me. That means that in that moment, I can actually customize or curate my interactions with that person because I'm baking who they are into the calculation.
Well, right. I mean, I would have done a better job if I would have said, you're doing a great job. I just think this could be a really interesting addition to what you're already doing so well. And I love you, and check it out.
Totally. So I tell people all the time with 2s, you can't tell a 2, a helper, that you appreciate them and love them. You cannot tell them that too often. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now for you as a 3, you like to be appreciated, but you actually like to be admired more than appreciated. Am I right?
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely.
You would rather be, let me put another statement out there. As a 3, chances are, if you're a 3, you would tend to want to be respected more than liked.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure.
Not so for a 2.
They want to be liked.
They want to be liked. They want to be appreciated. They're not as concerned with admiration or getting ahead in the corporate hierarchy. They're just not as interested in that. It's about relationships. Now, if you know that, you can optimize and help a 2 live into the most productive and contented expression of him or herself. If you don't know that, you're just, Well,
this for leaders is incredibly powerful because...
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I mean, I know all my teams, 3, 6, 2, 9, whatever. I know all that. And it's so powerful, although I made a mistake this morning, in the way that I can communicate effectively to connect to what matters most to them and what drives them.
Let's just talk about 9s for a second. So 9s, these are the most pleasant, laid back, accommodating, go with the flow people you're ever going to meet. They are motivated by a need to keep the peace, to merge with the agenda or the program of others and avoid conflict at all costs. Okay? And these are fantastic human beings. And I would actually, tell you that I think some of our finest presidents, or whether you like the president or not, from a political perspective, it doesn't really matter. They were effective, right? You would say there are a lot of 9s in this category. What you want to do, one of the things you do want to do with 9s is just establish clear expectations and performance goals for them and encourage them to express their own opinions and preferences rather than simply mirror those of the group, right? So I'm always telling 9s, oh, okay, fine. So tell me what you're thinking about this plan. What are you feeling about this direction we're taking? Don't look around the room and figure out what everyone else is thinking and feeling and wanting. What do you think? I'm always with 9s trying to tease out, because they have so much wisdom and insight. I want to hear from them. But their default sometimes, if they're not very self-aware, is to kind of figure out, well, what does everybody else want to do? And I'm willing to go along with it, even if I may have some questions about it. Because it's easier to go with the flow of things than it is to put up a lot of resistance that burns calories, right? So a don't with 9s, I think, is don't let them sell themselves short. They tend to do that. They have so many. They really have considerable skills, and they tend to undervalue themselves. And I'm always telling people, don't let them do that, because they have so much to bring to the table. They just don't always believe they have as much to bring to the table as other people.
Got it. And so if somebody's listening as a leader and they think about the people that work with them, What advice would you give them as it relates to people that are emerging leaders inside of their organization, right? In other words, not to put people in a box, but if you had a leader, would you say these are the numbers that are probably most prone to become, your next leaders in the organization, and these are the people that you're going to have to work on a little bit more, and this is how?
Yeah. Well, that actually gets very case specific because it also is industry dependent, and it's dependent on where the organization is in its life cycle, right? And what makes a great leader in the defense industry might be very different than what makes a great leader, in a more lifestyle industry, or working for someone who works at Tiffany's is going to be a lot different
Got it.
than
Sure.
somebody in a different industry. So there's a lot of other factors that come into play. But what I always tell leaders is this: the number one thing you need to do is work on your own self-awareness and becoming healthy in your own type. A lot of leaders want to get this information and then just start to work on everybody else.
Like I just tried to do, right?
Yeah, it's like, well, no, actually, what you should do, Mr. or Mrs. Leader, is, hey, work on developing your own self-knowledge. Like, get to know yourself first. That's the most important thing. You need to model it for other people that's what you're doing. And you need to do it before you won't have any credibility if you just start doing this to other people. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
And if you don't do it that way, a lot of times what leaders do is, how can I get everyone else to be like me?
Right.
And I'm like, that is a gigantic mistake. And it's one that people make all the time.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that's the first thing, right? Work on yourself. Then get your team to take an IEQ-9 or read a book about the Enneagram. Go on a journey as a team to discovering as individuals who you are, and it also therefore how you can leverage all the different gifts that each of these types brings to the table. Create conversation and embrace this vernacular of the Enneagram as a team, so you can begin to talk about, well, this is how I see things, and this is my way of operating in the world, and then the beauty of that is that you can then begin to reduce a lot of relational and organizational inefficiencies.
I bet.
Once you start to understand people, right, you're going to have less conflict. You're going to have, fewer miscommunications. You're going to have all kinds of good things start to break out when people start to understand each other, appreciate difference, and understand that not everybody sees the world the same way, and we need all these different points of view in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And when you can do that, and a good leader then, I think, becomes sort of a conductor of the symphony of types,
Sure.
and helping them to play that instrument to the best of their abilities.
Mm-hmm. So, Ian, we went through those chronologically, which is awesome. But in the book, you sort of talk about it. It's organized kind of in triads. And,
yes.
And each set has sort of a different driver or motivator. Can you sort of touch on that?
Sure. Yeah. So there are 3 triads, at least for our purposes, in the Enneagram. You have 2s, 3s, and 4s. We call that the heart triad. These are people. These 3 numbers are the most relational and most image conscious numbers on the Enneagram. They're more feeling centered than other numbers. So 2s, for example, are very attuned to the feelings of other people. 3s tend to be a little confused and have trouble recognizing their own feelings and those of others. 4s are exquisitely attuned to their own feelings. Okay. Mm-hmm. So what you see is a pattern that will carry forth into these other triads, which is that one number tends to externalize, the other one tends to internalize, the other one tends to, kind of be out of touch with or has trouble recognizing things. In this case, and in that triad, that would be feelings. The head triad, which is the most mentally centered triad, is 5, 6, and 7, right? And sometimes it's also called the fear triad because anxiety tends to run as a major theme through those 3 types. And then 8, 9s, and 1s are in what we call the gut center. These are more people who operate from a place of the gut. They tend to do and act before they think or feel. That makes sense.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So they're very gut level people, and for them, anger is kind of an issue, right? Whether they're aware of it or conscious of it or not, anger tends to be a theme. Let's not say issue. It's a theme that runs through very powerfully in their lives. So another way to put that is, when a person walks into a room who's a 2, 3, or 4, what tends to get activated first is the heart, or they start to process the world at the level of feelings first. Doesn't mean that they don't think. It doesn't mean that they don't have, a gut level sort of way of being in the world. It just means that that's not what gets leaned on first, right? Mm-hmm. If you were a 5, 6, or 7, you tend to rely on and interact with the world at the level of the mind first. Mm-hmm. And if you were in that anger triad, you tend to interact with the world at that intuitive gut level first.
Got it.
So when you walk into you see how if you were, depending on the type, when you walked into a room, your way of processing what's happening would be completely different from the others.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And knowing that is terrifically helpful.
Ian, you've been incredible with your time, and this information I know will help so many people, so I'm so grateful for that. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I have to tell you, I am such a fan of Typology, your podcast.
Oh, great.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. So before we wrap, tell our listeners kind of what to expect from Typology, because I hope folks check it out.
Yeah, Typology is a podcast on which I sort of explore the human personality through the lens of the Enneagram. And what we do is we have guests on every week. 1 week I'll have a 9 on, or a 7, or I'll have a couple on that's a 3 and a 6. You know what I mean? It's just I kind of fly around the Enneagram, and I just interview them and talk with them about what it's like to be them. Mm-hmm. And in their setting and in their life, and how they've developed and how they've grown and where their challenges are. And it's really fun. And it's not only fun, it's fun because it's so informative and helpful for other people. And whether you're a mom or a CEO, or, you know what I mean, or whatever you may be doing, it's terrifically helpful to hear from each of these types.
Yeah, because you've got no matter what your role is in this world, you have a personality type.
You sure do. Yeah, you definitely do.
So, Ian, we end with rapid fire. I'm going to fire off some questions to you, and you just hit me back. All right?
Ooh, okay.
You ready? Okay, so your Enneagram type.
4.
Got it. Yep. The last book you read.
The last book I read was, you're going to laugh because it is called The Soul of an Octopus, A Surprising Exploration into the Wonder of Consciousness. And it was a National Book Award finalist. It's a wonderful book. It's a book about sort of depth sea life, life of these creatures, the octopus, and their incredible brains.
Oh, wow. All right. Interesting. So a book you'd most recommend for others.
All right. So there's a book, and it's got a terrible title that doesn't do justice to its depth. Okay. But one book I often recommend to people, particularly if they're over the age of, let's say, 30.
Okay.
Is a book
Darn
called...
it, I just missed that.
Oh, sorry.
Just kidding.
It's called Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life.
Okay.
And it's by a Jungian analyst whose name is James Hollis, Hollis. And it's just a terrifically thoughtful, well-written book about finding meaning in your life as a human person, particularly as you head toward the middle years. So I'd say 30, 35 plus on.
That's cool. Okay.
Yeah, very good book.
One thing you can't live without.
Oh, music.
Wow. Because you're a 4. You're a romantic.
I am. And I actually, funny enough, my first career was in songwriting.
Yeah.
And that was sort of a great love for me, was writing music. So I am a music fan. Oh, can I give you one more?
Yeah, please.
Dogs.
Do you have how many do you have? Do you have a ton?
No, right now I only have 1, but I've had 7 dogs and over the years, and I am, for whatever reason, a dog lover of all dog lovers. I'm a nut for dogs.
That's awesome. What is your favorite leadership resource?
My favorite leadership. I mean, this is dumb, but I'm gonna say it. I love the Enneagram. I know that sounds, so I got to think of a different one, I guess.
No,
right?
but you're an unselfish person, so we can take that authentically.
And also, can I give you a crazy one?
Yeah.
And this is something, again, that I'm always telling leaders, and they look at me a little cockeyed, but that's why they pay me the good money, I guess, I think they ought to read more fiction.
I heard that the other day from another guest. That's interesting.
Really?
I did. And I asked them, and they read all fiction, and it's so interesting. And why does that just unlock this sort of creative side that helps?
I think that one of the things that fiction does is it widens the aperture of imagination. Mm-hmm. It gives that part of our brain that's always functioning at the analytical level a little bit of a rest. And is, a little bit more playful and open, and also exploring the interior world of characters, of other people. Just because a character is fictional doesn't mean they don't exist. They actually do exist out there somewhere.
Sure.
And it just helps you understand the human condition, like who people are, what are their challenges, how do they think, how do they respond. And I just think it brings online faculties and sensitivities that are not brought online by reading straight nonfiction.
That is cool. What's one of your favorite fiction books? I mean, is there any you'd recommend to folks?
Oh gosh, so many. There are so many. I would say The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. You essentially can't go wrong with the Russians. Okay?
Okay.
Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, any of the great Russians have just incredible writing skills and insight into the human mind and person.
Okay. That's awesome. The show's called Game Changers. So one last question. Who's a game changer in your life who inspires you and why?
I have a bunch of this. One would be Desmond Tutu. I actually met Desmond and worked with him for 2 days once, and I watched him interact with people, and his way of being in the world was deeply affecting and moving to me. His ability to see people from the guy parking cars to the president of a country. I mean, just treated them the same way and with the same level of curiosity and interest. So he left a mark on me. Another person would be Yo-Yo Ma, the cellist. His commitment to his instrument, but his joy is what I find so interesting and moving. It's his quality of being in the world that I find.
The way that they live, the way that they do what they do. The way they show up.
The way they show up for life. And I really, I have a lot of heroes. Those would be, I could go on. If you want a long list of heroes, those I can give you.
No, that's amazing. Ian, thank you so much for your time. I know this is going to help so many people. I know it helped me. And so thank you for that. And thank you for what you've given our listeners. Really grateful.
Thank you so much. It was a joy to be on with you.
Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.